63,000 trees are cut down every week. That's 314 acres of trees cut down every week to produce the Sunday edition of the New York Times. One newspaper, 63,000 trees chopped up, turned to pulp to produce paper to give us what? And if you cut out all the bad news, you have the classifieds and a few car ads. It seems odd, that so much energy is going into the fact that it's just bad news. Have you noticed lately how much bad news is coming our way? I mean, every day, the news reporter, the anchor man gets out, 11 o'clock news, if you can stay up that late, and he says, "Good evening." And then for the next 30 minutes, he tells you why it's not good. It's over and over and endless, and we're living in an election campaign right now, and there is mud slinging. I mean, you feel like they're dripping with mud, and there's name calling. And we got the job in November. All the deplorables had got to vote for the despicables. I mean, it's amazing. And yet it really shouldn't surprise us, because the scripture says, all we like sheep have gone astray. We've turned everyone to his own way. And all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Even Paul said, "Oh, wretched man that I am." So it really shouldn't surprise us that we have some despicables. But it's bad news. Constantly a diet. A diet of bad news that constantly comes, got to do something to you. It might even give you a bad dream. It's going to do something. Paul, in the 5th chapter of Exodus, gives us some good news for bad times. And the church ought to be a place where you get some good news, because the church ought to be a place where it's a bridge over troubled waters, because we have to face troubled waters. And God somehow has to take us from where we are and shelter us so that in the storm, we have an anchor. And that's the church's job, and I hope that I can fulfill that mission today with some good news for troubled times. Paul opens up in the 15th verse of the 5th chapter. He says, "See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise." What he is saying in down-to-earth language is, watch your step. We're stepping in a world where there's a lot of quicksand. Keep your eyes open. Look before you leap. You got to be careful, because the devil is around us like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. And there may be people who don't believe in the devil, but that doesn't change the bad news that we got, and it keeps on coming. And we got to watch our step. But he's saying basically, he says, use your head. Don't be naive. Use your head. And then he goes on to explain something that we need to hear. He says this, he says, redeeming the time because the days are evil. I know you've probably heard that passage many times. Redeeming the time because the days are evil. I'd just like to break it down. When he talks about the days being evil, he's referring to the days that are filled with misfortune, filled with trouble, filled with sadness, filled with difficulties, filled with problems. That's what he means by when he's using the word evil here. He's talking about the difficulties that we got to face. And he says, and redeeming the time means learning how to deal with the obstacles and finding opportunities in them. Because if you're looking for opportunities, you're going to be looking for a long time. We need to learn how to look for opportunities where the obstacles are, because so often that's where they are. I remember years ago I read a story about a man who took a job in a factory sweeping. It's the only job he could take. And so he was sweeping. He came in at 5 o'clock and he would sweep all night. He had allergies, so he'd be sneezing the whole night. That was the man who invented the Hoover vacuum. It's in adversities where the mother of invention is. There was a secretary who kept making mistakes on a typewriter, and she was frustrated with that. She went home one day and she mixed some chemicals together and came with whiteout and became a millionaire. It's finding, God help us to see, to find the opportunity that's mixed into the adversity. That's redeeming the time. Because the days are evil, the days are filled with trouble and difficulties. This week I was reading about a guy who took his girlfriend to an island. He rowed the boat. Took her to the island. When they got there, he was going to have a picnic. She said, "You forgot the ice cream." He got in the boat, went and rowed back to the marina to get the ice cream, and then he rowed back to the island, and she said, "You forgot the chocolates, sir." He got in his rowboat and went to the marina to get the chocolate. And that's the guy who invented the first outboard motor. That's what it takes. It usually takes a problem of some kind to trigger an idea that can be developed. That's what Paul means when he says, redeeming the time because the days are evil. Don't let the time hem you in to the evil day. Let the time push you into a wall where the evil day is so that you can come out fighting and find a way of making a victory out of something that doesn't look like a victory. Years ago, there were 2 shoe salesmen that were sent to Africa to open up new markets. One of the salesmen wrote back and he says, "I'm coming back home. Nobody wears shoes out here." The other shoe salesman wrote back home and said, "Send me a boatload of shoes because everybody needs shoes out here." Many times it's really the way you see something. It's the way you look at it. If you let the difficulty fill your head with the difficulty and only the difficulty, then you come up with something negative. But if in the difficulty, God help us here, if the difficulty could bring a little bright light somewhere that you could see your way through the corridor, that's where miracles take place. That's where God's victories come our way. There is a passage that Paul writes to next, and I want to explain. He says, "Therefore, do not be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is." If there's one question a minister has to deal with over and over again, says, "Yeah, Pastor Joe, I don't know what the will of God is for my life. I mean, I've been struggling for years. I wish I knew what the will of God. If I knew what the will of God was, I would do what the will of God is." And so we're constantly looking for the will of God, and it's out there somewhere. I realize that there is some difficulties when it comes to the will of God because we don't always know what move God is going to put us into and which way we should go. But there is something about the will of God that should be so clear that you could see it even if you were running. And it's this: God always capitalizes on what he's got. If you want to know what the will of God is, learn and pray that you will be able to capitalize on what you have. So often we try to capitalize on what we don't have. Well, if I only had, if I had, then I would. And we fail to realize that we got to learn how to capitalize on the very thing. That's what God does. God capitalized on a slingshot. He could have used a bazooka to bring Goliath down. But he uses what he has. We're supposed to follow in his steps. So if that's the will of God, then somehow that ought to tap us on the shoulder, and we look around and say, well, what are my resources? What time do I got? What kind of health do I have? Okay, I'm gonna use what I have. God used the jawbone of a mule in Samson's hand to bring down 1,000 Philistines. On that day, he could have used an AK-47, but God uses what he has. And Jesus used a boy's lunch to feed 5,000 hungry people. Because the will of the Lord centers around this: God uses what he's got. If that's the will of God, then I need to follow in his steps. The Lord, help me to look and see what I got. because I know you'll use what I've got. And years ago, in 1975, we were meeting at the Jolly Roger Inn in Anaheim, and we needed a building. We had a contract for 12 weeks. So it was the 6th week, and we didn't have any permanent place to worship. When we stumbled across this building, a theater. And the first thought I had was, well, it's a theater. And the second thought was, well, a theater has got a stage. It's got a marquee. And I think we can make this thing work. Of course we had a problem. We had no money. But we let money keep us from doing what it is that God can do. God doesn't need money to get his work done. He's waiting for us to take a step. If you take one step, I'll take 2 steps towards you. If you take what we had, this building was selling for $250,000. We had, I think, $5,000 in the bank. And we told the owner, knowing that's going to be a killer. He said, I'll give it to you for 10 months, no rent. Come up with a down payment. God uses what you have. What do you have? What opportunities do you have? What does the situation look like right now with what you've got? Because if you want to know something about the will of God, that's where God is going to go. He's going to work with what he's got. And we shouldn't be spending our time worried about what we don't have, because we don't have a lot of things. I think some churches make a mistake when they take up offerings. Well, we're going to have to close the doors. If the money doesn't come in, we got to shut down the doors because God's going out of business. Sure. Church has been around for 2,000 years. You could be sure that if Jesus doesn't come, it'll be around another 1,000. God uses what he has. He uses people like us. That ought to be the clincher for the argument. He uses us. Paul says this, he says, and do not be drunk with wine, in which is dissipation, excess, but be filled with the Spirit. And how is that good news? That's great news, to be filled with the Spirit. And he's drawing a contrast between being drunk with wine and being filled with the Spirit, or being intoxicated with the Spirit. Well, I've never been drunk, but I know what drunk people do. I've watched them. They say things. Have you ever run across a drunken person? He says things and does things that don't make sense. They're crazy. They're dangerous. A couple of years ago, before I had Little Max, I had Just Lady. We're at the train station, and I'm sitting down at the bench in a little park area, and this drunk comes wobbling over with a big smile on his face. He had a smile on his face, and he's coming over, and he's looking at Lady. And Lady's looking at him. Now, Lady has an angelic face, but don't be fooled by looks. So he's coming towards Lady, and the first thing that came to my mind said, don't pet the dog. It's almost as if I didn't say that, because he came looking with a big smile on his face, come down close. Lady's now baring her teeth. And I'm holding on to the leash, and when he gets close, Lady lunges after him, growling and barking, and I said, what part of don't touch the dog did you get? That got his attention. He smiled and walked away smiling. When people are drunk, they don't recognize danger. They don't process trouble the way a sober person would process trouble. And Paul is telling us that when we are intoxicated in the Spirit, we will say and we will do things that the sober person wouldn't think of doing. Years ago, a plane came down in the Pacific, and it happened to come down not too far from a Japanese fishing boat. And the fishing boat moved towards the wreckage, and the pilot was swimming around in the waters, and one of the crew members dove into the water to rescue the pilot, bring him back to the boat, and did rescue him. And a day or so later, the captain wanted to do a ceremony for this brave crew member, and asked him this question, what made you dive into shark-infested waters? He said, I was drunk. I didn't know there were sharks in the water. When a person is intoxicated, they don't see things and they don't react to things the way other people would see and react. And that's why Paul says the next thing. He writes, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. And somebody might say, you know, the only thing that comes out of his mouth is God stuff. Speaking to one another in psalms and hymns. Because when you're intoxicated with the Spirit, by the way, if you're speaking in psalms and hymns, you're speaking things that are uplifting. And so when you go through some stuff, and you will go through some stuff that is not uplifting, but what comes out of your mouth are words that are uplifting. You want to see the definition of drunk? Speak to your mountain. Like Jesus said, and say, go. If there was a sober-minded person on there, listening to what you were saying when you were speaking to your mountain, they would say, something's wrong with this person. Seems like they don't know what's going on. No, they're just intoxicated with the Spirit, and they're doing what Jesus told them to do. And so they're speaking to the difficulty, they're speaking to the problem, and saying, go in the name of Jesus. Speaking. And then singing. Even if you can't carry a tune. Singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. Singing. You got to be intoxicated to do that. Sing at times, you know, so many times what's really going on is we're singing like we're singing. Here's what we may be humming it or maybe thinking about gloom, despair, and agony on me. If it weren't for bad luck, I'd have no luck at all. Gloom, despair. As I was singing, that's the song that we sing. We got so much negativity around us that it gets on the inside, and we start actually dictating what's going on the inside. You know what is amazing me about this election? There's some things that don't amaze me at all, but there's one thing that amazes me about the election. The candidates are being trashed, harpooned, and lampooned. And then when they come out to face the people, with a smile, I say they're drunk. They got to be drunk. What is it that they're missing? They're not missing anything. They know, they know something we need to know. We need to know that whatever you happen to be going through, that's like singing a song and being intoxicated in the Spirit. We need to sing a song. The children of Israel, they were in the wilderness. God delivered them out of Egyptian bondage, and now in the wilderness. And in the wilderness, they were facing all kinds of difficulty. It was hot in the daytime, cold at night. There was no food. Water was scarce. They were thirsty. And after a while, it got to them. You could handle it for a day, but we're talking about 40 years that they've been out there. So after a while, they started becoming really upset, and they started telling Mo, we want to go back. Go back to what? Go back to slavery. We want to go back to the mud hut. That we want the garlic and the leeks and the cucumbers. We want to go back to the whip of the taskmaster. And they were singing a song. I asked Nancy to put this song together for me. I thought I would sing it to you. To the tune of Home, Home on the Range. It goes like this. There's nothing to do. We're going to sue. The sand is so hot and we travel a lot. We've got nothing to munch. Just this manna for lunch. And we all think we're going to rot. That's the song they were singing. That was only the first verse. The second verse, they wanted to stone Moses. They wanted to go back. And all through the wilderness experience, you hear this negative song that they keep on singing, gloom and despair. My first pastorate was a long time ago in Westfield, New York, and there was an elderly, in my first pastorate, I would go visit all of the members in the church. It was a small church, and so I did a routine visiting everybody. But there was one elderly lady that I went to visit, and the minute I stepped in the door, something was wrong with the world. This is not going to work. Everything is wrong. Something wrong with the country. Something wrong with this city. It was a city with one red light. There was something wrong with the red light in that city. Something wrong with the library. Something wrong with everything. There was, from the minute I walked in to the minute I walked out, there was just negative talking. And when I walked out, I do remember driving home one time telling Nancy, I got to take a shower. I just got to get this stuff off of me. But I didn't do that. I didn't take a shower. When I got in the car, this is what I did. I had to shake that stuff out of my head. There's too much of that. Too much of that. That we are inundated with that kind of bad news. And then it comes out from us, and we reflect it. And I wonder we're not feeling good. And so Paul says, the church is the place where we learn how to redeem the time. We learn something about God's will. We learn to get drunk in the spirit and not with intoxication of the wine. But we got to speak to your mountains and sing it with a song that's melody in your heart. You got to lift up your voice. There's always going to be something that can steal your song. Chippy was a bird that loved to sing. And the housewife was vacuuming the carpet in the living room when she thought she would go into the bird cage and vacuum up what was in the bird cage when the telephone rang and she heard Chippy was sucked into the vacuum cleaner. She hung up the phone, went to the canister, opened it up, and there was Chippy, dusty and dazed. She ran to the bathroom, turned the faucet on full blast, and she washed Chippy off. Then she saw a hair blower, and she put it on hot, and she blow dried Chippy, and she took Chippy and put him back in his cage, and Chippy doesn't sing anymore. Because there is something that can steal your song. And that's what happens in life. We get knocked around, we get hurt, they pull a rug out from underneath us, the roof caves in, and we're all dazed and dizzy and dusty and scared. And our song goes. But if there is one thing that is a truth about the Bible, and this is the truth, that even in the worst of circumstances, I'm glad that Sally, you sang the song that you sang this morning, because it is well with my soul, even if it's not well with my head and it's not well with my body. It is well with my soul, and that's not going to change. Circumstances don't change it.
Through it all, my eyes are on you, and through it all, it is well. And through it all, my eyes are on you, and it is well.